All right, we're diving into a topic that is, well, it's pretty out there. It's called neurotheology, and it sits right at the wild intersection of faith and science. It's this really bold and, let's be honest, pretty controversial attempt to find God, or at least the experience of faith, tucked away inside the wiring of our own brains. And right away, this whole field makes us ask a question that is just massive. I mean, think about it. If we can actually map what's happening in our neurons when we pray or meditate, what does that really tell us? Is science getting a peek into the mind of God? Or is it just reading the mind of a person who believes? So, here's the game plan for how we're going to break this all down. First, we'll figure out what neurotheology even is. Then, we'll look at how in the world you can try to scan something as personal as the human spirit. After that, we'll see what the brain is actually doing during these moments, tackle some of the major criticisms of this whole project, and wrap it all up with the one big question that's left hanging. Okay, let's get into it. First things first, what are we actually talking about when we use a word like neurotheology? Okay, so at its very core, it's the study that tries to connect brain science with religion and theology. It's really an attempt to find the biological machinery, the actual physical brain activity that's going on behind our most profound spiritual experiences. We're talking everything from deep, focused prayer to that feeling of being one with the universe. But the ambition here, wow, it is absolutely huge. One of the field's founders, Andrew Newberg, he isn't just looking for a few little connections here and there. Nope, he's aiming for this grand, unified theory, a mega-theology. The idea is to use what we know is universal about the human brain to understand what might be universal about religion itself. I mean, that is an incredibly audacious goal. That all sounds fascinating in theory, right? But how do you actually do it? How do you observe an experience that is, by its very nature, so completely internal and personal? And yeah, this is the million-dollar question. I mean, a spiritual epiphany isn't exactly something you can just summon on demand, especially not when you're stuck inside a noisy, cramped machine in a lab. So what tools do they even have? And what are the trade-offs? Well, researchers basically have to make a tough choice. On one side, you've got EEG. It's amazing for timing. It can tell you when something happens in the brain, like instantly. But it's pretty bad at telling you where. On the other side, you've got things like fMRI, which are fantastic for pinpointing the exact location of the activity. The catch? There's a delay. You're always looking at a snapshot of what was happening a few seconds ago. And the practical headaches just keep coming. The banging and clanging of an fMRI machine can make deep meditation feel almost impossible, especially for a beginner. Sure, a seasoned monk might be able to tune it out, but then are you studying meditation or are you just studying someone who's really good at ignoring noise? Plus, you have to try and capture the data at the exact peak of the experience and account for things like whether your subject is a smoker, which can totally change blood flow to the brain. Getting clean, reliable data is just incredibly tough. But here's the thing, even with all those challenges, decades of this research have started to show a pretty consistent pattern. So let's take a look at what these brain scans are telling us about what's going on up there during moments of intense faith. Okay, so one of the most common things they find is that activity in the frontal lobes goes way down. You can think of this area as the CEO of your brain. It's in charge of focus, planning, and making things happen. So when this area gets quiet, it lines up perfectly with that feeling of surrender, the sense that you aren't making something happen, but that something is happening to you. The driver of your brain is taking its hands off the wheel. Now, at the very same time, we often see activity drop in the parietal lobe. This part of your brain is basically your inner GPS. It's constantly working to give you a sense of where your body ends and the outside world begins. When that part of the brain powers down, that boundary just seems to dissolve, and that can lead to that incredible feeling of oneness, of being connected to everything. And here's the real kicker. While all of this is going on, the limbic system, the emotional center of the brain, is firing on all cylinders. This activity essentially stamps the experience with this profound sense of meaning and importance. So what's the result? For the person going through it, that spiritual moment can feel more real, more true than their normal, everyday life. So we have these really fascinating findings. But what do they actually prove? Does seeing this brain activity explain faith away as just a bunch of neurons firing, or is it pointing to something else? This right here is where the critics start to chime in. So the biggest critique, summed up perfectly right here, is that neurotheology is often accused of confusing the map for the territory. Think of it this way. Seeing a brain scan light up in the areas associated with love isn't the same thing as the feeling of being in love. One is the biological footprint, but it's not the experience itself. And this leads to some other major objections. Critics say the field often treats the brain like it's just sitting in a vat, totally ignoring the social settings, the culture, and the world that actually shape our beliefs. They also argue that it sometimes dodges defining really important words like supernatural, which ends up creating this very narrow brain-only view of a phenomenon that is just so much more complex. So where does that leave us? We've got a field with some really powerful findings on one side and some pretty powerful critiques on the other. Let's see how these ideas are actually being applied out in the real world and what fundamental question that leaves us with. And, this is not just some debate for a philosophy class. These ideas are actually being put into practice. You can see it right here in this real syllabus for neurofeedback training program. They start with the basics, get into the equipment, but then look at week 9, observation intensive. This is where it gets hands-on, focusing on structured coaching and detailed note-taking. People are taking this abstract science and turning it into practical tools to help others regulate their own minds. And that really brings us to our final question, which is actually posed by a critic of the field. Even if neurotheology doesn't have all the answers, even if some of its foundations are a little shaky, does that automatically mean it's not worth doing? It's a question that really forces us to think about how science actually progresses and what it truly means to try and understand the deepest parts of ourselves.